think we need to come to the realization that for reasons of finance and economics, our grip on things is weakened. To be frank with you, the Russians have now visited with the Saudis. Now the Chinese have been to visit with them. And the Saudis are preparing, like much of the non-European world, to exit use of the dollar. They see us, frankly, as falling apart financially and economically. They don't have much confidence in our ability to protect them. And they see a better way ahead with Russia and China, both of whom have enormous influence over Iran. Much better influence over Iran than we do. So I think this is one of several steps that you're going to see in the future. Remember that China and Russia are both members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is building a financial system that is external to ours. In other words, most of the world wants to dump the US dollar. And you can see that happening in our banking sector right now. Why? Because frankly, we're debasing their currency. Whenever they do business in dollars, we pass our debt on to them. Our debt is now, what, 33, 34 million, something, a trillion in that department. Nobody wants to do business with us anymore.
And what does it say as the kind of new 21st century geopolitics is setting in, that China is now the one that is not just trying to broker deals between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also they're the only ones talking about a ceasefire or potential peace deal with Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing that Americans don't understand, because they've been propagandized for years in the wrong direction, China is not interested in war with anybody. China is entirely about business and prosperity and self-enrichment. They are going to be the dominant power in Asia for reasons of economics and finance. It has nothing to do with military power. So they're in a position to visit with Zelensky after they visited with Putin and probably offer a deal of some kind. I suspect the Chinese will say, if you're willing to come to a new territorial arrangement with Russia, we will bankroll your restoration, your reconstruction. The problem for Zelensky is that he's entirely dependent on the cabal in Washington and the Kolomoisky and Soros and other oligarchs, if you will, in the West. So I doubt seriously he'll take the deal. But I think that's what the Chinese will ultimately do. The Chinese want desperately to build rail lines to carry commerce and commodities and services back and forth between Europe and China, Japan, and Korea. Central Asia can be stable now, thanks to Russian influence and control. The problem they've got right now is Ukraine. Ukraine is in the way of that commercial traffic and that economic relationship. So they want peace desperately. They don't want war. And I think they're probably going to get it. They're just not going to get it immediately, because I don't think we'll allow it.
I'd like the latest take on the details on the ground, your latest take between Russia and Ukraine. According to the Daily Mail, it says that Russia suffers deadliest day in Ukraine war as 1,090 men lose their lives. And the Daily Mail says Putin's bloodlust takes horrendous toll on his own forces, with bitter battle of Bakhmut raging. What is the latest on the ground in Ukraine, and how does it apply to us?
Well, all those headlines are lies, Charlie. The Russians haven't taken those heavy casualties at all. In fact, we think that the Russians have had, since the beginning of the war, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 dead. The exchange rate over the last few weeks has been about 1 Russian for every 5 Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been bled white, and they're getting ready, for reasons that make absolutely no military sense, to commit more forces to Bakhmut, which has turned into an enormous ambush, if you will, for the Ukrainians. The Russians are happy for thousands of Ukrainians to pile in there so that they can be concentrated and become easy targets for artillery, rockets, missiles, drones, and so forth. There's very little direct fire between the two sides in the area, because the Ukrainians have simply made themselves lucrative targets. And they've taken tremendous casualties. We think that they're up to 200,000 dead at this point. So you've just got to take anything that comes out of the Western media and quite frankly dismiss it. They're all lies trying to bolster the Ukrainian cause, because Ukraine is on its last legs. Now you have the muddy season. The muddy season followed a very, very short winter. the Russians opted not to attack in the winter because they just didn't get the hard freeze all over Ukraine that they need for hundreds of thousands of troops to advance. So they've decided to sit back, and the Ukrainians continue to come to them, which makes it easy for them to kill the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have become pop-up targets. And at the same time, you've got this terrible mud. And the black earth in Ukraine is 10 to 15 feet deep.
Wow.
So you're talking about a mud pit in which tanks and trucks and anything, frankly, on the ground that moves will just sink to the bottom. So there's nothing going to happen in terms of major offensive operations from the Russian side until the mud dries out. That'll take another month or two.
So I conveyed a similar opinion to what you just said to a neoliberal, neoconservative recently. And he asked me this question, and I didn't have a great response. He said, well, then how come there has not been more territorial gains by the Russians if the Russians are dominating? How would you respond to that?
Well, the Russians control territory that constitutes 90% of gross national product in Ukraine. They now control all the key resources, coal, iron, even agriculturally, they've got some great territory, but most of it is manufacturing. What Ukraine has for a scientific industrial base, anything that is worth holding on to, the Russians have already got. They can take the rest of it when the ground dries out, if that's what they decide to do. And the area they're sitting on top of is traditionally Russian. The population there isn't Russian. In fact, the Ukrainians have complained bitterly in Bakhmut about the fact that the Russian people there are continually informing the Russians as to their location. And one of the reasons the battles in the Donbass have taken so long to fight is that the Russians have declined to use their conventional weapons of mass destruction, the thermobaric warheads on their heavy rocket artillery. If they did that, the battles would be over within a day or two. But they've got thousands of Russian citizens, Russian speakers, who live in Ukraine in those areas, and they're not willing to kill them. So the Ukrainians have naturally tried to get close to the Russian speakers. That hasn't worked out very well for them because they tell the Russians where they are. The Russians come in. It's long and arduous, but eventually they kill them and drive them out.
You don't hear that on the Western media. That is for certain.
Well, you got to remember, Charlie, Putin is evil. Anything he does is evil. Russians are bad. It's all nonsense. And when we finally get to the truth, we're going to find out that the only serious war crimes committed in this war were committed by Ukrainians against Russians and against the civil population. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is really desperate. I mean, you're now dragging in boys and women to fill the slots that young men formerly filled. He's got very few reserves left of able-bodied men. His generals keep telling him to pull out of this, but he keeps feeding the meat grinder. And if you're willing to come and impale yourself on the Russian defenses, there's not much incentive for the Russians to move. Why not wipe out the Ukrainian army, what's left of it? By the time the spring rolls around, there'll be almost nothing left. And I think that's where we are. Now you're talking about blackouts everywhere all over Ukraine. The whole energy sector is being destroyed. There's almost no air defense left, which means the Russians can use whatever they want, aircraft, missiles, at will.
The New York Times, the CIA via the New York Times says they didn't bomb the Nord Stream pipeline. With all your experience, who do you think bombed the Nord Stream pipeline?
Well, you know, I'm told that Santa Claus and the Good Fairy died in the same car crash that killed Santa Claus and a whole host of other fictional characters. Look, the idea that a private boat, a yacht, sailed with very dangerous and volatile explosives into the Baltic and somehow or another magically found the spot and sent divers down on their own to do this damage, and they were allegedly Ukrainian, is absurd. There is no Ukrainian naval capability. There's no naval capability in the Baltic other than American or potentially British capability, with some exceptions with the Norwegians and Swedes that could do this. We did it. Cy Hirsch told the truth. And I'm sure that 95% of everything he said was accurate. He may have gotten some minor details wrong, but there's no question about it. Cy Hirsch is right.
The intelligence agencies do this via the New York Times, where they say something. They do this all the time. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about this, where they say something where they try to mislead you that technically, if in many years from now declassified documents come out, they can say that, well, we told you that it was a force close to Ukrainian forces, but it's the way that they could deny it. I mean, they're just lying by other means.
Well, look, Charlie, everything that is being told to the American people and the Europeans in the West about the Ukraine war has been largely fictional. There's very little truth in any of it. I mean, that was the point that I was trying to make when we last spoke. The Nord Stream problem is very much the same. Remember that initially the answer was, oh, well, the Russians must have done it to themselves. That was dropped. That went nowhere. And now it's the mysterious elements of the non-existent Ukrainian Navy in civilian attire went out and did it. That's absurd nonsense. The whole narrative for this war is nonsense. People don't understand how much they've been lied to, but this is helpful. The bad news is the Russians know the truth, and we effectively executed or committed an act of war against Russia, but we also committed an act of war against Germany. The German population is quietly enraged, and it's going to be very difficult for the Germans to stay with us much longer, whether it's NATO or it's this phony war with Russia in Ukraine. Everyone is sick of it in Europe. The governments haven't changed yet, but when they go down, that'll be the end of all the nonsense.
Quietly enraged. That usually doesn't go well when the German people get quietly enraged. History tells us that. So kind of in closing here, what is your prediction then of the next year of how things end up getting resolved in the Ukrainian-Russian dispute? How do you see this playing out?
Well, the first thing, Charlie, is that what's happened with the Silicon Valley Bank is going to spread to other banks. Our national sovereign debt is finally going to come crashing down on our heads. We're going to watch our currency debased. We'll see an attempt to ratchet interest rates down to come through this. None of it's going to work. We're going to be bankrupt. We're going to have to default. As this happens, it's going to be impossible for us to sustain the level of support that has kept Ukraine alive, at least to the Ukrainian forces fighting against the Russians. That's why I think Xi's visit is important. And remember that China, Russia, India, increasingly Brazil, all of the Central Asian states, parts of Southeast Asia are all exiting the financial system that we dominate and control. Everyone is getting away from our debt. And, excuse me, these countries are now pegging their currency to gold. And that's something we cannot do. So we're about to enter into an entirely new world. Within a year, the world that you see today won't exist anymore.